Hello everyone. In this video, I'll be covering my tips on healing the Restless Cabal encounter on Mythic difficulty as a Discipline Priest. Despite this boss being the first encounter in this raid, it is actually a very challenging boss. I would say on release, unless you had a very specific composition with a lot of multi-dots, it was on par if not harder than Jaina on Mythic. But after the nerf of the enrage timer to 9 minutes and 30 seconds, I would say that the fight is doable with pretty much any composition, and I would place it slightly easier than Jaina. That being said, this encounter is very reliant on how good the healers are, not in terms of output, but in terms of how well they can do the mechanics and keep the raid alive for very specific mechanics in order to progress fast. Also, Disc Priests are very good on this fight because even though the HPS is lower than pretty much any other healer on this fight for Disc Priest, we have shields that can be used to save people through the AoE damage while they are on high stacks of the Promise of Power buff, allowing them to do a lot more damage. Also, due to the fairly tight enrage timer on this fight, the damage that the Disc Priest can output is also very helpful. For talents, I recommend mostly the standard talents with Purge the Wicked and Sins of the Many. Since DPS is fairly important and there will be always at least 2 targets and sometimes more, Purge the Wicked actually brings a lot of value in this fight. The only talent row I would consider changing is the last row, where Evangelism and Luminous Barrier are both viable options here. Normally, Luminous Barrier is very bad to pick because often it is actually a net HPS loss because Barrier, the regular Barrier with the talent, generally reduces more damage than Luminous Barrier can actually block with the shield. At the same time, Evangelism being one of the highest output cooldowns that we have as a Disc Priest. However, the HPS requirement on this fight is actually very low, with most of the damage outside of the storms coming in bursts, which make it not so great for Evangelism to be able to heal. At the same time, Luminous Barrier is an absorb, which means it can be used to possibly lengthen the duration of the debuffs that give extra DPS to all the other damage dealers so that you can beat the enrage timer. It'll depend on whether or not your raid needs your Luminous Barrier in order to have higher uptime on the debuff to kill the boss. If not, either you have other ways to save the DPS through the burst AoE damage, or you don't need to hold the debuff long to beat the enrage timer, then Evangelism will be the better option, as the HPS through some of the parts in where a lot of damage is coming in will help stabilize the raid and make sure that no one dies. Make sure you coordinate this with your other healers and your raid leader to decide whether Luminous Barrier or Evangelism will be better for your raid. I personally swapped between Evangelism and Luminous Barrier a lot during progression, but eventually I went with Evangelism because after the nerf we realized that we don't need to hold the Promise of Power debuff for such a long time that Luminous Barrier is required to save the raid. Outside of the talents, one other thing that I need to mention for this fight is the trinket that drops from the second boss of this instance, Void Stone. It's really important that you have this trinket even on a normal version, because even at the lowest eye level that you can get on normal, it'll absorb more than enough to be able to keep the DPS with 9 stacks of Promise Power debuff alive through Crushing Down. The HPS on the trinket is not bad, but ultimately the DPS gain that you're gonna get from using this trinket will outweigh any other healing throughput increase trinket you can possibly get in this game. In fact, we did normal and heroic before we did mythic in order to be able to get this trinket as many healers and DPS as possible. When we started attempting this, we had the trinket on every single intellect DPS and healer except one mage. But with the recent nerf, it's definitely not required that you hold this many. But it's still very good and will help you progress faster if at least your healers can have this trinket. If you're using the strategy of doing 2 of each relic, starting with the Trident, then Void Stone, then the Tempest Collar, this fight is actually pretty consistent between pulls and you can get down exactly what you have to do step by step. The differences are gonna come when there is a DPS difference due to who gets the Crushing Doubt debuff, who has to be dispelled early, and things like that. And when you face a boss, to each relic will change the timers on the rest of the boss abilities, since the rest of the boss abilities are on a set timer, whereas the relic activations are on boss health, which is dependent on your DPS. The beginning of this fight is very straightforward. You want to dot up both of the bosses, but make sure that you don't get aggro from the caster before whoever your ranged tank is able to get the debuff on them. Otherwise, even one tick on you and other people around you, and them getting mind controlled due to the debuff expiring, will quickly result in a wipe. I use Schism combo on the opener to do as much damage as possible because it's going to come back before Lust when I'm going to use it one more time. After that, you want to group up in order for every DPS and any healers that are able to put out a significant amount of damage to stack for the Dark Herald debuff that comes out so that everyone can get the Promise of Power debuff. Make sure you and the raid knows which side you're dodging to, because if you get split here, not everyone's going to be able to get the debuff, and that's going to cause DPS issues down the line. If you can have somebody very tanky with the cooldown soak the initial void crashes, it simplifies this part a lot, but it's not necessary. Lust should be coming around 5 stacks, so make sure that you drop your Shadow Fiend and do another Schism combo while you have this debuff to put out as much damage as possible. For us, we had the Warrior tank also get the debuff, so I knew that the tank had to be dispelled at a certain time. So I had to dispel myself first, since if I have 9 stacks to the debuff and I dispel the tank, I would instantly die from the damage that comes back. In order to do this, I made sure I moved out of the raid at around 8 stacks to mass dispel myself, to prepare myself to be able to dispel the tank. Be careful when you mass dispelling yourself to not have any other people in the range, because if you accidentally dispel DPS that could have done a lot more damage, that could be bad. Or if you get more than 3 people in your mass dispel, it's very easy to just one-shot yourself. From this point on, it's unlikely that you as a healer would be getting the damage buff, so it's very important that you soak as many void crashes as possible. For DPS, especially melee DPS, sometimes it can be very hard to see the smaller void crashes, and it will one-shot them. So if you have 6 or 7 void crashes out, it's very easy to have a random DPS die or range be unable to DPS because they have to move out of it. So it's very important that the healers and the tanks who don't have the debuff soak as many as possible as quickly as possible. The first relic we do is the caster on Trident, which should quickly blow up with every single DPS having 9 stacks of the buff. Right after this, or it could be right before if your DPS is not high enough, you will get the first Crushing Doubt debuff with everyone having 9 stacks of the debuff. If these 2 Crushing Doubts go on any target with 9 stacks of the debuff, they need to be dispelled before the first tick, which happens around 2 seconds, in order for them to not instantly die and blow up the entire raid. Once those targets are dispelled, make sure you have Atonement on them to keep them healthy as they move out with their debuff, and be prepared to save the person with the debuff that you're assigned to. As a Discipline Priest, there are several ways you can save the DPS with 9 stacks from the 2 Crushing Doubt debuffs expiring. And the easiest way is to apply your Void Stone Trinket. A single Void Stone Trinket, even on normal, will be enough to absorb both the damage from the Crushing Doubts, provided that they move out far enough. If you're doing this, make sure you don't apply Atonement to the same target, because the Atonement healing can take away a lot of the absorb before the Crushing Doubt actually hits and cause the target to die. Another way you're going to be able to save somebody with 9 stacks is to use Rapture and apply the shield before the first Crushing Doubt expiring, and then reapply your Rapture shield before the second Crushing Doubt expires. This should be just enough absorb on the target in order to keep them alive. If both Crushing Doubts are expiring at the same time, you can put a Rapture shield and put a Pain Suppression on the target, and that person will also live. If you are not using Rapture, then the person will have to use a very strong personal cooldown, or you'll have to drop either Luminous Barrier or a regular barrier on top of them. Depending on your raid composition DPS, this might be the only time where you actually have to do 9 stacks of the debuff with Crushing Doubt expiring on the entire raid, so make sure you have a plan in order to save all the DPS. Soon after this, you'll be pushing Cthulhu on the Trident, and because the Cthulhu as expiring do very high amounts of damage, it's almost impossible to keep anyone alive with 9 stacks to do it. Therefore, everyone needs to be dispelled before the first ad expires. With 5 healers, you generally want to start single dispelling people around 77% of Cthulhu in order to be able to dispel everybody before the explosion. Remember that Warlocks and Shadow Priests can dispel themselves, so you should prioritize people who cannot dispel themselves. If there aren't enough dispels and you're forced to mass dispel right before the explosion, make sure that you don't get more than 2 people, and if you're gonna get more than 2 people, try to use Pain Suppression or get an external cooldown so that you don't instantly die from the feedback damage from dispelling and the ad exploding. If you need another round of debuffs on the DPS, the next one that you're most likely to get is the 8th Dark Herald, which comes out at the same time as 2 Crushing Doubts. If the two crushing targets are also getting the debuff here, then you need to make sure that you kind of move out with them and focus them through healing, because when their debuff expires, they'll be around 5 stacks. And if those expire back to back without any healing on those two targets, they will most likely die. It is unlikely that any other players, even at 5 stacks, will die one shot from these crushing doubts, so try to put your focus on the two people with the actual debuff. At this point, you should be moving the caster boss to the void stone in order to activate that relic next. Make sure you stay within range of your ranged tank, as they will be taking a significant amount of damage while moving, and maybe even move out of your range because they have to move in a certain way so that they don't put the debuff on anyone in the raid. Make sure you're not actually on top of them so you get the debuff yourself, but just make sure to keep a close eye on their HP. As the void stone activates from the caster boss, you try to have all the tanks, including the ranged tank, at full health, but it's not too important, as with enough debuffs out on the DPS, the shield will be broken very quick. Around this time, you'll also get 2 crushing doubts. Again, if they're on targets for 9 stacks, they need to be dispelled immediately, and if anyone needs saving, your void stone should be back up, and also your rapture should be back up if that's what you're using to keep people alive. After that, once again, make sure you dispel everybody before Fthul phases. And it's especially important that you dispel people early for this Void Stone Fthul activation, because if you dispel people after the Void debuff goes out, but before the ad explodes, you can't heal yourself back up from the damage you take from dispelling, and that could easily put you low enough so that one explosion will kill you. Also, you really need to focus on shielding the ranged tank here, because they generally don't have that big of an HP pool, and the caster boss shooting at them as well as an ad exploding can be lethal. You'll also likely get crushing doubt debuffs at some point while you're dealing with these ads here, and it's really up to whoever is calling the interrupts to know when you should interrupt and when you should let one go. The 2 crushing doubt debuffs expiring at the exact same time as an ad explosion will likely one-shot somebody, even if not everyone in the raid dies. And it's important that you coordinate it so that you can get rid of the ads in a safe manner. As a general rule of thumb, if the debuff is expiring within the next 5 seconds, it's a good idea to interrupt 2 more times in order to get through the crushing doubt and heal them up. But if there's still over 10 seconds left on the debuff, it might be a better idea to let one through and then heal that up for the incoming crushing doubt damage, and then interrupt the last ad a few more times before your raid gets healthy. The ads don't become immune to interrupts until 2 minutes after they spawn, so you have plenty of time to continuously interrupt throughout the raid in order to survive the crushing doubt and be able to get rid of the ads safely. At this point, you should have done all the debuff rotations to make sure that you have enough DPS to beat them in range. Otherwise, you might have to do another set of debuffs here, but if you do another set of debuffs here on the entire DPS group, it can get pretty hectic in terms of movement due to a lot of ores being around and not having enough dispels to go out in time for the Tempest Caller. So I really recommend that if you needed more DPS, that you use the debuffs prior to this point to be able to eke that extra DPS out in order to beat the range. But if you do need to get the debuffs in order to get more DPS, then the best targets to get the Promise of Power debuff are the players that can either dispel themselves or have an immunity in order to save themselves from a crushing doubt. Try to wait for the next crushing doubt here before getting the debuff, so that you only need 1 save before you have to get dispelled for the Tempest Caller. Even though the order has been the caster boss and then the melee boss empowering each relic so far, it's actually better to do Fthul again on Tempest Caller after the Void Stone, because having the Visage up during the Tempest Caller activation for Fthul will cause a lot of chaos, because the Visage needs to be DPS, the interrupts have to be done, the healers are busy keeping everyone alive through AoE, and it's really difficult for everything to go right in that case. Since Fthul has a lot more health than the caster boss, make sure you are bringing the caster boss down close to 25% so that you can continuously focus on Fthul after his Tempest Caller activation is over, so that you can bring him down as low as possible before doing the last relic. This part is probably the only part where healing output is important and that there is a significant amount of healing to be done, But provided that you save a lot of healing CDs, since there aren't that many reasons to use them beforehand, it shouldn't be too difficult to survive the actual lightning AoE from the Tempest Caller. Just make sure that you have all the interrupts assigned so that none of the ads explode during the Tempest Caller AoE. Once the AoE is over, you do the same thing that you did in Void. You look at Crushing Doubt and its timers, and you call interrupts as needed to keep everyone healthy before an ad exploding or Crushing Doubt debuffs expiring. After this, rather than facing the caster boss right away, I suggest DPSing Cthulhu down as low as possible while you wait for the next Crushing Doubt to come out and heal the raid before going into the next part, as getting a Crushing Doubt with this next part can be very lethal. This also helps equalize the health between the two bosses, since melee boss has a lot more health than the ranged boss. Once it's safe to face, make sure that you have another set of healer CDs ready to heal through the AoE, and because of the 50% damage reduction that players do during the Tempest Caller AoE, it's actually recommended that you ignore the first Visage ad cast. Instead, you want to group up in range for a Tremor Totem. At the same time, you want to put down either Barrier or Link, or use other personal cooldowns that help you survive the AoE damage. Note that the range tank will not be able to come in to the raid in order to get AoE healing and Barrier and Link, so it's a good idea to put some type of external cooldowns on them. And if you have Pain Suppression up, then this is the best time to use it on your range tank. Once you have survived this part, there really isn't any more healing to be done, but there are a couple of other things that could potentially wipe you. One is the energy orbs that are going to start spawning from Tempest Caller, and since a lot of the DPS are going to pick up the next debuff again once another Crushing Doubt has gone out, it's important that healers not only soak the Void Crashes, but are also soaking these energy balls that comes out of the Tempest Caller. Besides that, at this point the Void Stone pull-in will be extremely strong, and even with movement abilities, you will probably not be able to beat the pulling in effect. For this reason, it might be a good idea to move the two bosses closer to the Void Stone so that people getting sucked into the Void Stone can just stay on top of it to ignore the sucking in ability, so that they don't get hit by a stun orb or Void Crash or other bad effects. It's likely that Void Crash will spawn on top of the entire raid that it's stacked up in the Void Stone at this point. So it's a good idea to have a Warlock Gate here so that people can get out to safety from the Void Crash that's coming in. At this point, the only thing left to do is to DPS the bosses down fairly equally. There's still around 20 seconds to kill the other boss when one dies. So if you're getting really close to enrage, it might actually be a good idea to DPS down the melee boss first before the caster boss, since his enrage is more likely to kill your raid faster than the caster boss, who can only attack once every few seconds. Provided that you have most of the raid alive, it shouldn't be that difficult to meet this enrage timer, despite having a bad composition for this boss, as long as you utilize the first two sets of 9 stacks of debuffs that you're going to get before the tridents and before the voids. As a disc priest, it's really important that you have all your dispels down, know when you're doing the dispels, and be ready to help out with calling on when ads should be interrupted and when they shouldn't, when bosses should be faced, when they shouldn't, when the range tank needs healing, when he doesn't, as well as keeping shields on players that could potentially die from AoE. The other extremely important thing is to just soak as many Void Crashes as possible. The smallest Void Crash will kill you if you soak it at the same time as an ad explosion, or there's Crushing Doubts going out at the same time and you're soaking too. So make sure you shield yourself every time you're going to soak a Void Crash, and you might even want to just punish yourself afterwards to heal yourself up. Besides the tanks and very few points in the fight, there really isn't too much healing to be done, so really focus on all the mechanics that can potentially kill people in this raid. And don't worry about your HPS, and don't even worry about your DPS too much. It's more important that you do everything you can to allow your DPS to put out as much throughput as possible. One last thing to note is that since mana isn't too important on this fight, as long as you get innervate here and there, you might want to be using the potion that gets you out of the stun rather than using a mana potion, because it's very easy to accidentally get stunned even if you're trying your best to focus on the orbs, especially when the Void Stone is pulling you very fast near the end, or you're really focused on making sure everyone survives the Tempest Color activation. So it's a good idea to use this to get yourself out of the stun if a Void Crash spawns on top of you while you're stunned. Also utilize your Life Grip to save people who are stunned and are within the cone to get MC'd or are about to get killed by a Void Crash. The number of mechanics on this boss aren't that high, but it is a fairly complicated fight that is going to take you a few attempts in order to get down the rhythm of what you have to do as a Disciplined Priest. At first, I found this boss very frustrating, especially when I saw the 8 minutes and 30-second enrage timer with us only having one Shadow Priest and one Warlock. But with the nerf to 9 minutes and 30 seconds, I actually really enjoyed doing progression on this fight, and I think compared to Jaina, I had a lot more fun doing progression here. Of course, the next boss, Unad, is a completely different story, and I'm sure I will hate myself for even trying to kill this boss. That's it for my tips on the Restless Cabal encounter on Mythic difficulty for Disciplined Priest. I hope that this video helped you out if you're progressing on this boss, and I'll see you guys on the next video.